The morning mist clung to Charleston Peninsula like a shroud of destiny on June 17, 1775. Colonel William Prescott stood atop Breed's Hill, his weathered hands gripping a crude spyglass as he surveyed the British warships anchored in Boston Harbor. The sight that greeted him would have unnerved lesser men. His Majesty's fleet bristled with cannon, their black muzzles pointed directly at his hastily constructed earthworks. "They mean to drive us from this hill," Prescott muttered to his aide, Captain Thomas Knowlton of Connecticut. The morning air carried the distant sound of drums from Boston, where General Thomas Gage's redcoats were preparing for what many believed would be a swift suppression of colonial rebellion. The previous night had been one of feverish activity. Under cover of darkness, approximately 1,000 colonial militia had marched from Cambridge to fortify what they believed to be Bunker Hill. In a fateful error that would define the day's events, they had instead entrenched themselves on the lower, more exposed Breed's Hill. This mistake, born of confusion in the dark and imprecise maps, would prove both disastrous and oddly prophetic. General Artemas Ward, commanding the colonial forces from his headquarters in Cambridge, had issued clear orders, established a defensive position on the Charlestown Peninsula to threaten British Hill. Boston. The strategy was audacious. A ragtag collection of farmers, merchants, and craftsmen would dare to challenge the world's most formidable military machine. Yet as dawn broke over Massachusetts Bay, these same farmers worked with desperate efficiency, their shovels and pickaxes carving defensive positions from the rocky New England soil. Across the water in Boston, General Gage received reports of the colonial fortifications with a mixture of irritation and disbelief. Since the confrontations at Lexington and Concord 2 months prior, tensions had escalated beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. The King's forces, nearly 3,000 strong, controlled Boston, but found themselves effectively besieged by an estimated 15,000 colonial militia surrounding the city. Major General William Howe, recently arrived from England with reinforcements, studied the colonial positions through his own telescope. A veteran of the French and Indian War, Howe understood terrain and tactical advantage. The Americans had positioned themselves well. Their earthworks commanded the approaches to Boston and threatened British supply lines. Yet Howe also recognized the fundamental weakness of the colonial position. They occupied ground that could be flanked and had limited avenues of retreat. They made a grave error. Howe observed to his staff, "Breed's Hill may appear formidable, but it's a trap of their own making. We shall demonstrate the folly of challenging His Majesty's regulars." In open battle, the colonial forces represented a cross-section of New England society. Farmers from Lexington stood alongside merchants from Salem, their common bond a growing resentment toward British rule that had transformed ordinary men into reluctant revolutionaries. Many carried their own muskets, some dating from the French and Indian War, others family heirlooms passed down through generations. Their ammunition was precious and limited, a constraint that would define the day's tactics. As the sun climbed higher, both sides prepared for a confrontation that would reshape the colonial rebellion. The British viewed the engagement as an opportunity to crush American resistance decisively, while the colonial side as a chance to prove their resolve. Neither side fully comprehended that they stood on the threshold of a battle that would demonstrate both the futility and the power of righteous determination. Against overwhelming odds, the stage was set for a collision that would echo through history, transforming a tactical British victory into an American moral triumph that would inspire a revolution. General William Howe stood resplendent in his scarlet uniform, surveying the colonial positions from Copp's Hill in Boston. As the morning of June 17th advanced toward noon, the British commander embodied everything the empire represented: professional military bearing, unwavering confidence, and the absolute certainty that disciplined European warfare would prevail over colonial enthusiasm. The British force assembling for the assault represented the pinnacle of 18th century military organization. The 5th, 38th, 43rd, and 52nd regiments of foot formed the backbone of Howe's attack force, supplemented by the elite 10th Light Infantry and Grenadier companies. These were not mere soldiers but professional warriors, many veterans of campaigns across Europe and North America. Their red woolen uniforms, pristine white crossbelts, and gleaming bayonets projected an image of invincible martial power. According to historical accounts documented in military archives of the period, the British force numbered approximately 2,400 men, organized in 3 distinct assault columns, Each regiment carried the battle honors of previous conflicts mined in Quebec. Martinique names that spoke to British military supremacy across the globe. Their brown-best muskets, while heavy and cumbersome, delivered devastating volleys when fired in coordinated ranks. Brigadier General Robert Piggott commanded the left wing. Tasked with assaulting the colonial redoubt directly, his force included the 5th, 2nd, and 43rd Regiments, solid line infantry units with extensive service in North America. The right wing, under Howe's personal command, would advance against the rail fence extending from the main fortification toward the Mystic River. The British artillery, though limited in number, represented state-of-the-art military technology. 6-pound and 12-pound cannon, served by experienced Royal Artillery crews, were positioned to support the infantry assault. However, the rough terrain and hastily planned nature of the attack would limit their effectiveness, a factor that British commanders fatally underestimated. Captain John Chester, writing in his journal after the battle, observed the meticulous British preparations with grudging admiration. Their formations were perfect, their discipline absolute. They advanced as if on parade, each man in his proper place, officers mounted, and conspicuous in their gold lace and scarlet facings. The British strategy reflected conventional European military doctrine, adapted for colonial conditions. Howe planned a frontal assault designed to overawe the Americans through sheer professional competence. The sight of advancing British regulars, bayonets fixed and colors flying, had broken colonial resistance before, most recently at Lexington, where militia had scattered before disciplined volleys. Yet seeds of overconfidence had already taken root in British planning. General Gage's intelligence reports consistently underestimated American resolve and tactical capability. The colonials were viewed as enthusiastic amateurs who would break and run when confronted by professional soldiers. This fundamental misunderstanding of American character would prove costly. The assault plan revealed both British strengths and blind spots. The frontal attack maximized the impact of disciplined firepower and bayonet charges traditional British advantages. However, it also negated opportunities for tactical finesse and failed to account for the defensive advantage east that rough terrain provided to determined defenders. Major John Pitcairn of the Royal Marines, veteran of the Lexington encounter, expressed typical British sentiment. These colonials lack the stomach for real fighting. A proper charge by His Majesty's troops will send them running back to their farms. Such attitudes, while reflecting genuine confidence in British military superiority, also demonstrated a dangerous underestimation of American determination. As the British columns formed for assault, regimental bands played traditional airs, the White Cockpit and the Grenadiers' March, melodies that had accompanied British victories across the empire. The music served both to maintain morale and project an image of inexorable advance. Yet these same tunes would soon accompany one of the bloodiest days in British military history. The contrast between British professionalism and American improvisation could not have been starker. Where the colonials had worked through the night with shovels and determination, the British prepared with parade ground precision and absolute confidence in their military supremacy. The earthworks atop Reed's Hill bore little resemblance to European fortifications, yet they represented something far more significant: the determination of free men to defend their liberties against tyranny. Colonel William Prescott walked the perimeter of his crude redoubt, encouraging men whose calloused hands had traded plowshares for muskets in defense of principles they could barely articulate, but instinctively understood. The fortification itself measured roughly 130 feet square, its walls standing 6 feet high and constructed from earth, stone, and whatever materials the colonials could scavenge. No military engineer had designed these works. They sprang from practical New England ingenuity and desperate necessity. Captain Ebenezer Bancroft of the Massachusetts militia later wrote, "We build not according to the rules of war, but according to the dictates of common sense and urgency of our situation." Within the redoubt, approximately 400 men represented the heart of colonial resistance. These were not professional soldiers, but citizens and arms farmers from Lexington and Concord, mechanics from Boston, students from Harvard College. Their ages ranged from boys barely 16 to grizzled veterans of the French and Indian War. What united them was not military training, but shared grievance against British policies that threatened their traditional liberties. The colonial weaponry reflected this citizen-soldier character. While some carried military muskets captured at various arsenal raids, many bore hunting rifles and fowling pieces passed down through generations. Ammunition remained critically scarce. Each man had been issued no more than 15 rounds, with strict orders to make every shot count. This shortage would define colonial tactics and contribute to the battle's ultimate outcome. Captain Thomas Knowlton commanded the Connecticut troops manning the rail fence extending eastward. From the main redoubt, his men had constructed a barrier, using fence rails, hay, and earth-improvised fortifications that would prove surprisingly effective against British assault. Knowlton himself was a veteran Indian fighter, whose tactical instincts would serve the Americans well in the coming hours. The colonial command structure reflected the democratic spirit that would later define American military tradition. While Prescott held overall command, decisions were often made through consultation and consent rather than rigid hierarchical authority. This approach, though sometimes inefficient, fostered a sense of shared ownership in the defensive effort. Dr. Joseph Warren, recently appointed Major General in the Massachusetts militia, arrived at the redoubt wearing civilian clothes and carrying a musket. As one of Boston's most prominent citizens and a leader of the Sons of Liberty, Warren's presence symbolized the transformation of political resistance into armed rebellion. His decision to fight as a common soldier, rather than assume command, reflected the egalitarian ideals driving the colonial cause. Historical records from the Massachusetts Historical Society indicate that colonial morale remained surprisingly high despite obvious disadvantages. The men understood they faced the world's most powerful military force, yet they also believed they fought for something worth the risk: their homes, families, and the rights of Englishmen that they claimed as their birthright. The defensive plan was simple: allow the British to approach within close range, then deliver devastating volleys before falling back to secondary positions. This strategy maximized the impact of limited ammunition while taking advantage of the Americans' superior marksmanship. Many colonial soldiers had learned to shoot hunting game in New England forests, making them natural marksmen compared to British regulars trained for European battlefields. As the morning progressed, additional colonial forces arrived to strengthen the position. Captain Samuel Greeley brought additional Massachusetts companies, while New Hampshire men under Colonel John Stark took position along the beach below the main redoubt. These reinforcements, though welcome, also highlighted the improvised nature of colonial military organization. The atmosphere within the redoubt mixed nervous anticipation with grim determination. Men checked their muskets repeatedly, discussed tactics in hushed tones, and offered mutual encouragement. Some wrote hasty letters to wives and families, understanding that this day might be their last. Yet beneath the surface anxiety lay a deeper current of resolve. These men had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. They had taken up arms against their king, transforming themselves from loyal subjects into rebels facing charges of treason. The stakes could not have been higher. The drums of the British advance began their ominous rhythm at precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon. General William Howe, mounted magnificently on his bay charger, raised his sword and gave the signal that would commence one of the bloodiest encounters in British military history. Across the water from Boston, 28 barges carried the assault force toward Morton's Point, their hulls cutting through the harbor waters with deadly purpose. The sight that greeted colonial defenders was both terrifying and magnificent. Scarlet ranks deployed with mechanical precision, their bayonets glinting in the afternoon sun like a forest of steel. Regimental colors snapped in the harbor breeze, the Union Jack, and various battle honors that spoke to decades of British military supremacy. The light infantry companies formed the right of the assault, while the grenadiers, the Army's elite shock troops, anchored the left wing. Colonel William Prescott moved among his men in the redoubt, his calm demeanor masking the anxiety that gnawed at his stomach. "Wait for the command," he called out, his voice carrying across the earthworks. "Let them come close before you fire. Aim low and make every shot count." The wisdom of these words would soon become apparent as the British began their methodical advance up the slope of Breed's Hill. General Howe's battle plan reflected traditional European military doctrine, a coordinated frontal assault designed to overwhelm defenders through superior discipline and firepower. The light infantry would clear the beach and turn the American left flank, while the main force advanced directly against the redoubt. British artillery, positioned on Copp's Hill, across the harbor, would provide supporting fire throughout the assault. The advance began with parade ground precision. British officers, their gorgets gleaming and swords drawn, led from the front in the finest tradition of His Majesty's service. The men advanced in perfect lines, their brown best muskets shouldered at the precise angle prescribed by manual of arms. Each step was measured, each formation maintained despite the rough terrain and oppressive heat of the June afternoon. Captain John Chester of the Connecticut Militia, positioned near the rail fence, watched the British approach with growing amazement. They came on with steady pace, dressing their ranks and maintaining perfect order despite the obstacles before them. It was a sight both beautiful and terrifying. The very essence of military discipline made manifest. The first British volley crashed across the hillside at approximately 50 yards, range close enough for colonial defenders to see the individual faces of their enemies. The musket balls whistled overhead or thudded harmlessly into the earthworks, most shots flying high as was typical of military musketry of the period. British training emphasized rapid fire and bayonet assault rather than individual marksmanship. Colonel Prescott waited until the redcoats reached 30 yards before giving the order that would echo through American military history: fire. The resulting volley erupted like thunder across Breed's Hill, sending smoke billowing over the redoubt and creating momentary chaos in the British ranks. Unlike their enemies, the Americans aimed carefully, picking individual targets and making their precious ammunition count. The effect was devastating. British officers, conspicuous in their gold lace and mounted positions, proved particularly vulnerable to American marksmen. Major John Pitcairn of the Royal Marines, veteran of Lexington, fell mortally wounded in the opening exchange. Captain James Abercrombie of the Grenadiers collapsed with a musket ball through his chest. Throughout the British ranks, the methodical advance suddenly wavered as men fell by the dozens. The British pressed forward despite mounting casualties, their training and courage carrying them toward the American works. Yet the colonial fire remained withering in its accuracy and devastating in its effect. The light infantry, attempting to clear the beach positions, found themselves enfiladed by New Hampshire men under Colonel John Stark, who had positioned his troops behind a stone wall that provided perfect cover. As the assault reached the base of the American earthworks, British discipline finally cracked. Officers fell faster than they could be replaced, and the men, bloodied and confused, began falling back toward the harbor. The withdrawal, though conducted in good order, represented the first major repulse of British regular troops by colonial forces. General Howe, observing the retreat from his command position, felt the sting of unexpected defeat. His professional pride demanded another attempt, despite the obvious cost in British blood. The colonials had proven they could fight, but Howe remained convinced that British courage and discipline would ultimately prevail. The first assault had lasted barely 30 minutes. Yet it had shattered British assumptions about colonial military capability, while demonstrating the terrible cost of frontal attacks against determined defenders. In strong positions, the second British assault commenced at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, and this time General William Howe had learned from his bloody education. The light infantry and grenadiers reformed their ranks with grim determination, their scarlet uniforms now stained with sweat and dust, many bearing dark patches where wounded comrades had fallen against them during the retreat. Howe's tactical adjustments reflected both his military competence and growing respect for colonial resistance. The artillery had been repositioned for more effective fire support, and the assault columns reorganized to concentrate maximum force against the weakest points of the American position. Yet these modifications could not address the fundamental problem. British forces remained compelled to attack uphill against prepared positions, defended by increasingly confident Americans. Within the colonial redoubt, ammunition concerns had become critical. Colonel William Prescott moved among his men, redistributing cartridges from the wounded and dead while maintaining the steady calm that had already made him legendary among the defenders. "Make ready, boys," he called out as British drums once again signaled the advance. "Remember, they must take this hill to win, but we need only hold it." The British advance began with even greater determination than before. Brigadier General Robert Pigot's left wing moved directly against the redoubt, while Howe personally led the light infantry companies against the rail fence positions, defended by Captain Thomas Knowlton's Connecticut men. The sight of a British general leading from the front spoke to both courage and desperation. Howe understood that British prestige demanded victory regardless of cost. Dr. Joseph Warren, the prominent Boston physician and politician who had enlisted as a private soldier, fought alongside common militiamen with a musket that had belonged to his grandfather. His presence in the ranks, rather than in a command position, symbolized the democratic ideals that were transforming colonial resistance into genuine revolution. Warren's decision to fight as an ordinary soldier while holding the rank of major. General represented something entirely new in 18th century warfare: leadership through example rather than privilege. According to battlefield accounts preserved in the Essex Institute collections, the second assault reached even closer to the American works. Before withering under accurate colonial fire, British casualties mounted horrifically as American marksmen continued to target officers and non-commissioned officers with deadly precision. The professional British Army was experiencing something unprecedented: a sustained engagement against opponents who refused to break despite overwhelming disadvantage. The rail fence position proved particularly deadly for British attackers. Colonel John Stark's New Hampshire men, positioned behind stone walls and natural cover, delivered enfilade fire that swept the British right wing with devastating effect. These were men accustomed to hunting in the New Hampshire wilderness, where a missed shot meant an empty table for their families. Their marksmanship skills, honed through necessity, now served the cause of liberty with terrible efficiency. The British retreat from the second assault was less orderly than the first. Units had become intermixed, officers were dead or wounded in unprecedented numbers, and even the discipline that defined His Majesty's service showed signs of strain. Yet these were professional soldiers with pride in their regiments and loyalty to their colors. Despite the carnage, they maintained enough cohesion to withdraw and prepare for another attempt. General Howe's personal courage during these assaults became legendary even among his enemies. He led from the front throughout both attacks, his uniform torn by musket balls, his horse shot from under him, his staff officers falling around him with frightening regularity. Yet he continued to advance, sword in hand, embodying the best traditions of British military leadership, even as his tactical decisions reflected the limitations of conventional European warfare. In American conditions, the colonial position, while still intact, showed signs of strain that would prove decisive in the coming final assault. Ammunition had dwindled to critical levels, with many defenders reduced to 5 or fewer cartridges. Some men had begun searching the bodies of fallen comrades for additional powder and ball, a grim necessity that spoke to both desperation and determination. Captain Ebenezer Bancroft of the Massachusetts militia later recorded the atmosphere. During the lull between the second and third assaults, we knew they would come again, and we knew our powder was nearly spent. Yet not a man spoke of retreat. We had made our stand, and we would maintain it as long as powder and ball allowed. The stage was set for a final, climactic assault that would determine not just the outcome of the battle, but the character of the emerging American military tradition. The third and final British assault began at approximately 3:15 in the afternoon, and this time General William Howe had abandoned any pretense of tactical finesse. With nearly half his force dead or wounded from the previous attacks, he ordered a concentrated bayonet charge against the American redoubt, a desperate gamble that would stake British prestige on the cold steel that had won battles from Minden. To Quebec, the British formed up with grim efficiency, their depleted ranks closed up and their remaining officers positioned to lead what many understood might be their final effort. The light infantry companies, reduced to barely half strength, prepared to assault the rail fence one more time, while the grenadier companies massed for a direct attack on Prescott's earthworks. This time, however, Howe had made a crucial tactical adjustment. His men would advance without stopping to fire, relying entirely on the psychological impact of a bayonet charge within the American redoubt. The situation had become desperate. Colonel William Prescott counted fewer than 200 effective defenders, and ammunition had dwindled to virtually nothing. Many men clutched muskets with empty cartridge boxes, while others prepared to defend themselves with bayonets, clubs, and stones. The earthworks that had seemed so formidable that morning now felt like a trap, with no avenue of escape. Dr. Joseph Warren moved among the defenders during these final minutes, his physician's hands now grimed with gunpowder and blood. His presence continued to inspire men who understood they faced almost certain death or capture. Warren's transformation from respected Boston doctor to common soldier embodied the Revolution's democratic ideals, the belief that liberty was worth any sacrifice, and that leadership meant sharing danger rather than commanding from safety. The British charge, when it came, represented the finest tradition of His Majesty's military service. Scarlet ranks advanced with bayonets fixed, their pace measured despite the carnage of the previous assaults. Regimental colors flew above men whose courage had already been tested beyond any reasonable limit. The sight was magnificent and terrible, the essence of disciplined valor, advancing against impossible odds. Colonel Prescott's final volley erupted when the British reached the base of the earthworks, barely 20 yards from the defenders. This last coordinated fire proved devastating, dropping British soldiers and windows across the assault front. Yet the charge continued, driven by professional pride and the knowledge that retreat was no longer an option. British grenadiers began scrambling over the earthworks, their bayonets seeking targets among defenders armed mainly with empty muskets. The hand-to-hand fighting that followed was savage and brief. Americans swung their muskets like clubs, while British soldiers thrust with bayonets and sabers. Captain Thomas Knowlton fell defending the rail fence, his Connecticut men fighting desperately with whatever weapons remained to them. The democratized violence of close combat stripped away all pretense of European military courtesy. This was naked struggle for survival. Dr. Joseph Warren died during these final moments, struck down by a musket ball as he attempted to rally the defenders near the redoubt's rear wall. His death symbolized both the cost of colonial resistance and the depth of commitment that was transforming political dissent into genuine revolution. Warren's medical practice, his political prominence, his comfortable Boston life all had been sacrificed for principles that many could barely articulate but instinctively understood. The American retreat, when it finally came, was conducted in surprisingly good order considering the chaos of the final assault. Colonel Prescott, among the last to leave the redoubt, maintained his composure even as British soldiers swarmed over positions his men had held for nearly 3 hours. The withdrawal to Cambridge represented tactical defeat, but preserved the core of the colonial force. For future engagements, British casualties from the 3 assaults were staggering by any standard of 18th century warfare. Over 1,000 killed and wounded from a force of approximately 2,400 represented losses that would have shattered most armies of the period. More significantly, the officer casualties, including numerous captains, majors, and field-grade commanders, deprived British forces of experienced leadership. They could not easily replace as evening fell over Charlestown Peninsula. British forces occupied the blood-soaked earthworks they had purchased at such terrible cost. General Howe surveyed the battlefield with the grim satisfaction of a professional soldier who had accomplished his mission while understanding its broader implications. The colonials had been driven from their positions, but they had also proven they could fight with skill and determination that demanded British respect. The Battle of Bunker Hill had ended in British tactical victory, but the strategic implications pointed toward a much longer and costlier conflict than anyone had anticipated. The smoke cleared over Breed's Hill as the sun set on June 17, 1775, revealing a battlefield that would forever alter the relationship between Great Britain and her American colonies. General William Howe stood among the earthworks that had cost him nearly half his command, surveying carnage that represented both victory and Pyrrhic defeat. The ground was littered with the scarlet-clad bodies of His Majesty's finest soldiers, their blood soaking into New England soil that had suddenly become contested ground. British casualties told a story that no amount of tactical success could obscure. Over 220 killed, including Major John Pitcairn and numerous other experienced officers, whose loss would weaken British effectiveness throughout the coming campaign. The wounded numbered more than 800, many of whom would never again serve in His Majesty's forces. For a professional army that depended on experienced leadership and unit cohesion, such losses represented a strategic catastrophe despite tactical victory. The American retreat to Cambridge had preserved the core of colonial resistance while demonstrating capabilities that shocked British military leadership. Colonial casualties, though significant at approximately 400 total, included losses that could be more easily replaced from the large population of militia surrounding Boston. More importantly, the Americans had proven they could stand against European regulars in sustained combat, a psychological victory worth far more than the tactical defeat they had suffered. Dr. Joseph Warren's death resonated throughout the colonies with symbolic power that exceeded his considerable political influence. Here was a prominent Boston physician, a Harvard-educated gentleman who could have remained safely in his comfortable practice, choosing instead to die as a common soldier in defense of American liberty. Warren's sacrifice embodied the democratic ideals that were transforming colonial resistance into genuine revolution, the belief that leadership meant sharing danger rather than commanding from safety. Contemporary accounts from British officers revealed growing respect for colonial military capabilities that would influence subsequent strategic planning. Captain Walter Sloan Lowry of the 43rd Regiment wrote to his family in England, These Americans fight with a determination and skill that we did not expect. They are not the rabble we were told to expect, but serious opponents who deserve our professional respect. The political implications of Bunker Hill extended far beyond the immediate military situation. News of the battle spread throughout the colonies within days, carried by riders who understood they bore tidings of revolution rather than mere rebellion. The fact that colonial forces had inflicted such devastating casualties on British regulars inspired confidence that independence might be achievable. Despite overwhelming odds, King George III's reaction to news of the battle, preserved in royal correspondence, revealed the growing realization that the American crisis required far more resources than originally anticipated. "The die is cast," the king wrote to Lord North. "These colonials have chosen rebellion over reconciliation. We must respond with the full weight of British military power, or risk losing our American dominions entirely." General Thomas Gage, overall British commander in North America, understood that Bunker Hill had fundamentally altered the strategic situation. His forces controlled Boston, but remained effectively besieged by colonial armies that had proven their willingness to fight. The tactical victory had actually worsened British strategic position by demonstrating the cost of offensive operations against determined American defenders. The Battle of Bunker Hill established patterns that would define the American Revolutionary War for the next 8 years. British forces would win most tactical engagements while failing to achieve strategic objectives that required controlling vast territories populated by increasingly hostile colonists. American forces would lose battles while winning the larger conflict through persistence, strategic retreat, and the ability to replace losses more easily than their professional opponents. Perhaps most significantly, Bunker Hill demonstrated that the American conflict had moved beyond political dissent into genuine warfare that would require complete victory by one side or the other. The blood spilled on Breed's Hill had made compromise impossible. Americans who had killed His Majesty's soldiers faced charges of treason, while British forces who had seen their comrades fall to colonial muskets could no longer view the conflict as mere police action against misguided subjects. The earthworks atop Breed's Hill, purchased with such terrible cost, would be abandoned by British forces within months as the strategic situation around Boston became untenable. Yet the battle's legacy would endure throughout the revolutionary struggle and beyond, establishing the principle that free men fighting for their liberties possessed advantages that no amount of professional military training could overcome. The Battle of Bunker Hill had indeed been a British victory, but it was an American moral triumph that pointed toward ultimate independence. In losing the hill, the colonials had won something far more valuable: proof that they could fight as a people worthy of freedom.